When discussing who the strongest villain in Godzilla history is, there's a lot of names that people will throw out. Dagon, Kaiser Ghidorah, Space Godzilla, and many others tend to pop up in arguments like that. However, in my experience, these two are by far the ones that people seem to really hinge on being the strongest. And those are Destoroyah from the Heisei era of films, as well as the Heisei manga, and Void Ghidorah from the anime trilogy. These two are both unbelievably powerful within their verse and are some of the strongest entities in all of Godzilla history in general. Today I'm going to be going in depth on who would actually win a confrontation between these two and the different ways it could actually turn out. Starting off with Void Ghidorah, there is no real argument you can really pull to argue Void Ghidorah is not a higher dimensional being. They outright call him that repeatedly throughout the anime trilogy. So as a baseline, he's at least a 4-dimensional being. However, this gets much higher as he utilizes supergravity, which is referenced as superdimensional constantly throughout all Toho material pretty much. Superdimensional can get him up to 5th dimensional. Void Ghidorah's realm and him as by proxy are also referenced to transcend time and space, which is 5D. And although his realm is never outright stated infinite, as it is just repeatedly called a void, and voids within nature tend to be infinite, that's what space is, you can kind of inference it is at least infinite. He's also stated to have at least like infinite power, so most likely he's in the infinite 5D range of power as well. Also, arguments that supergravity can get up to 11-dimensional, however those are very inconsistent with what we see within basically every showing of supergravity from the Showa era, Heisei era, and anime trilogy. So using that argument I find personally very shaky, as it doesn't really seem consistent with this other statements for the characters. As for what Void Ghidorah can actually do, well, he can straight up attack you from his realm, as we see him basically killing people by eating their shadows with his shadows somehow, which is a very odd ability, but we don't really see him do this to anything stronger than like a human being. So if this would actually work on Destoroyah, it's kind of iffy, as Destoroyah is definitely stronger than like anything we've ever seen Void Ghidorah use that ability on, though I am taking into consideration here. Void Ghidorah's mere presence, even in his avatar form, was actually straight up decaying the entire universe, which in Godzilla is typically a 4th-dimensional realm in its entirety. So even his avatar is potentially Uni Plus, or at least in the universal range of power, as we don't really know how long it would have taken to decay completely, but we can assume it wouldn't have been very long, seeing how concerned everyone was about it. To give you an idea how big the power difference between Void Ghidorah's avatar and his true form is, his avatar appearing near Earth just basically caused some massive storms. If his true form was to pop up, it's been stated it would have basically completely obliterated Earth within like a nanosecond. So yeah, there's some significant difference there, at least in the thousands to potentially millions of times power-wise. It's also important to note that Void Ghidorah doesn't really downscale off Godzilla Earth in his avatar state, as he had to actively nerf himself to fight Godzilla, and he was also unable to even really perceive the realm because it was so far below him that he was basically fighting blind. He also viewed Godzilla as little more than a fine meal, apparently. Not only that, but I mean, once his hacks were taken away, it would be like if you got trapped within like a video game essentially, and you couldn't even see what was going on, like you were in a 2D video game, and your perception was just turned off. You know, you should logically be stronger and everything in there, you just like, you don't know what you're doing, so obviously you could still die, and you just respawn here, and that's essentially what would have happened to Void Ghidorah. He didn't even die either, he's still in his realm, he just kind of popped back up there. Which basically means, no, he's not solar system level only in his avatar state. Godzilla Earth shows solar system levels of power, but Void Ghidorah views him as like nothing more than like a snack. So yeah, solar system level characters are essentially fodder to him. As for what Void Ghidorah can actually do, well, he can crush celestial bodies down to like almost nothing with supergravity. He can generate black holes. He can control most aspects of just like the fabric of reality. So he's essentially like on a god tier level there, off that alone. He can rapidly drain energy from his opponents, and he's also incredibly physically powerful, obviously, just due to his size. He's also dual intangible, as he's literally made out of energy, which makes physical attacks basically worthless against him, and he's also higher dimensional than most people he fights, which means touching him is almost impossible for someone on a third dimensional or even fourth dimensional level, pretty much. He's essentially untouchable, immortal, unstoppable, and is the strongest guy within his verse. So in other words, he's like beyond stacked, at least for the anime trilogy. He's without a shadow of a doubt the strongest newer character within Godzilla, other than like the novel version of Godzilla Ultima, if you buy the hyperversal scaling. And he's like basically beyond everything else in the newer era by a mile. Nothing in the monsterverse would touch this guy. But how does Destoroyah stack up to all that? Well, significantly better than the vast majority of the Godzilla fandom would probably assume on first glance. To understand Destoroyah's full scaling, you have to start far earlier in the Heisei era than the Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. Starting off with both the first film and Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, both of them have metas to get the base Heisei Godzilla to a 4th dimensional level in Uni+. Within the first film, there's an official guide statement that implies that base Heisei Godzilla, way back in the first Heisei film, is 200 times stronger than the Showa Godzilla. While I personally find this a little shaky, it is a real meta official thing and you can actually use it. In Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, there's heavy implications that Ghidorah has super gravity, much like the Showa version of Ghidorah, which is super dimensional. You can argue 5D for this, but I personally go more 4D, and that's more consistent with the Showa era. And there's no real reason to assume that Ghidorah scales anywhere near Super Godzilla, who is an actually confirmed 5D entity within the Heisei era, as the power difference there is kind of obvious. Then you move on to Space Godzilla, who has an even higher level of super gravity than Ghidorah did, which would put it at 5th dimensional. It's also referenced as being super dimensional as well, obviously. Just further backs up that chain of logic. On top of this version of Space Godzilla is able to light up an entire universe within the manga. Although a lot of people don't like using the manga and the films together, they are basically relative. There's very few differences between the two, and they have the exact same statements and logic there, so it's not like it really matters much. Like the FNAF games and FNAF novels, though they are technically different timelines, they should be relative to each other due to them sharing events and lore with one another. Moving on from this, Godzilla, once he got his red spiral ramp against Space Godzilla, was described as being so far beyond Space Godzilla that Space Godzilla, trying to drain his energy back after Godzilla blew his crystal up, which is what gave him the amp to begin with, would have resulted in Space Godzilla's instant death. The reason this is important is that Godzilla against Space Godzilla was literally fighting a guy on a higher dimensional level, and him is slowly gaining enough power to actually go toe-to-toe with him. Essentially meaning that Heisei Godzilla can amp his own dimensionality through just straight evolution. Space Godzilla being a literal clone of him, who's also referenced as maybe being a clone of Biollante, who is directly stated to have infinite evolution, would imply that even if Godzilla did get infinitely stronger than him on a 5th dimensional level, Space Godzilla should have been able to adapt to that even with his broken shoulder crystal, meaning that most likely Godzilla at least went up a dimensionality. Space Godzilla should have been able to adapt to another layer into Infinite 5D relatively easily, even well weakened, as he is basically a better clone of Godzilla, and Godzilla's shown blatantly better evolution than that. Most likely, by the end of Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, Godzilla is a 6th dimensional level character. So you can argue this is still just Infinite 5D. I feel it makes more sense and is far more consistent with the showings in film for Godzilla to be 6th dimensional with the red spiral ramp, which he keeps, by the way. There's a misconception that Godzilla in the Heisei era doesn't keep his amps, kind of like how Godzilla in the Monsterverse typically doesn't unless you count Evolve. But that is simply false. The reason Godzilla went burning is literally because he got so many amps within a relatively short period of time. They also say that he could have withstood the power of burning if he would have gotten them over a more spread out period of time, which he obviously didn't do, as he was basically getting amps almost every movie towards the end. Yet the misconception that burning was caused exclusively by uranium deposits on the island that exploded on Godzilla's face, and that Godzilla was just overloaded by a little bit of uranium, is just completely false. Godzilla is blatantly stronger than uranium. I don't understand why people try to argue that. Moving on from this, Junior within Godzilla vs. Destoroyah is described as being as powerful as his father pre-burning, which would include Godzilla with the red spiral ramp by the end of Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. Godzilla's amps go directly to his base. You can argue that this is just talking about Godzilla in base at the start of Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. However, due to the fact this is a direct statement in film and the lore fact that Godzilla just straight up keeps his amps, I think that's a little kind of shaky to really argue that, as that would be kind of just arguing that they're saying, it's kind of just arguing a low end that you can realistically get to a higher end, and you can't really fully debunk the higher end, is what I'm trying to say. And another reason why I think it's more consistent for Junior to be as powerful as a red spiral ramped Godzilla in his teenage form within Godzilla vs. Destoroyah is the fact that Destoroyah is only described as being 500 times stronger than Junior at best. And Junior, if he was only as powerful as a base Godzilla at the start of Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, would be 2 infinite dimensionalities below where Destoroyah should logically be against just a very heavily restrained burning Godzilla, which doesn't make any sense to me. So logically, Junior should be at least in that infinite 5D to 6D range, and Destoroyah should also, even before his perfect form, be in that same range of power. Well, some people might say this is inconsistent as they don't really show feats on that level. It's kind of like a Dragon Ball situation where Goku is pretty consistently considered a multiversal character, yet he's never destroyed a multiverse. And there are a couple big feats like Boo threatening to crash down the entire microcosm of Universe 7 that would get him there anyway. But there's also stuff within Godzilla like that, like burning Godzilla in the original Japanese film was described as being able to cause a second Big Bang due to the cosmology of the Heisei era, including fifth dimensional supergravity. That alone would be an infinite 5D feat, just due to the cosmology. Now, some people might argue that that's not true because they watched the American version of the film and they don't say that. They take dialogue out of films, you know, that kind of happens. It is an official statement within the film. That is canon to the era. Not to mention that earlier eras like the Showa that Toho themselves straight up say are under the Heisei era, straight up have universe busting level feats on screen like Zone Fighter destroying 4th dimensional realms like very early on into the Zone Fighter series, which is a feat on the same caliber as the stuff that would get other characters that are typically agreed upon at multiversal to multiversal. So why the Godzilla fandom in particular seems to have a lot of problems with this, arguing it's inconsistent as they only blow up like a city or something every fight. Like, you watch any other series with characters on that caliber, even comic books, you're not going to see universes get destroyed every single fight scene, like Goku Black vs. Goku. Their punches were only breaking buildings, yet in reality they should be hitting with like massively multiversal levels of power with every single hit. Or look at Superman vs. Doomsday in the comics. Both of them can be argued all the way up to multiversal at that point in the comics, and they didn't even destroy Earth. And Doomsday got thrown into the sun, and it was like stuck there. Yet no one's going to argue the comic Superman is only like city level because of that. It's something that only seems to get argued for Heisei Godzilla and other variants of Godzilla, as well as a couple other kaiju characters within Toho that seem to get just downplayed because showings in film, because people don't understand the suitimation, and it takes a lot of money to have a universe blowing up every movie. It also takes a lot of weird writing to try to write that into a movie and not make it sound like a bunch of bullshit. Toho can't write an efficient story if every single fight scene has the entire universe collapsing in on itself or something. That's not how an effective story works. Moving on from that, Destoroyah is capable of going toe-to-toe with burning Godzilla, and at the start of the fight was blatantly the stronger of the two, casually ragdolling burning Godzilla like he was nothing. It wasn't until burning Godzilla gave himself infinite amps. Depending on your interpretation of the infinite heat ray, this was either outright putting him further into the infinite 6D layers, as the other red spiral ramp can be argued to have done instead of upping dimensionality, or as it's an upgraded version of the red spiral ray. You could also argue this straight up amps his dimensionality like the red spiral ray should have done. Both of these are, you can argue both of these like pretty well. You can also argue that both these are bullshit, but my personal interpretation is that it's more consistently in the more infinite layers into 6D, but I could definitely see it also going into the higher dimensionality with every blast of the heat ray, as Destoroyah should also have the same evolution that Godzilla has, and it would logically make sense with a character like Destoroyah whose whole thing is evolution, and his evolution surpasses characters with like some of the most insane evolutionary stuff in fiction in general, should be able to actively adapt to whole dimensionalities like that. It might sound a little wild, but I mean, that's kind of just how the Heisei era is. They just kind of go wild when they want to. Either way, Destoroyah is going to be very comfortably into the multiple layers of the Infinite 6D, or potentially all the way up to, like, you can argue up to around 90, depending on how many times you think the Infinite Heat Ray was actually amping Godzilla. So, yeah, Destoroyah is kind of just insane. Any way you slice it, the dude's like way stronger than he seems on paper. Now, there are anti-feats that people try to use to debunk all this. And the biggest one by far is Destoroyah got beat by the military. No, Destoroyah did not get beat by the military. Something people seem to forget when they watch the film is that even Destoroyah in his Archean form was taking literally no damage from the Cairo lasers, the same ones that kill him eventually. So he evolved to basically nullify that whole thing. He was no longer really weak to it. The only reason he was weak to it after, in his perfect form, was because he just got hit with the Infinite Heat Ray, which is unironically stated to have like infinite heat and shit, which his weakness is extreme temperatures. Just a friendly reminder. The dude essentially got hit with like the ultimate super microwave, and then you got thrown into like a freezer that like subatomically crushes you, because it's just that cold. He essentially got hit with like Gamera's fireball times like infinity. And then he got thrown into like 30 Kiryu's firing the absolute zero cannon. And his weakness is extreme temperatures. So I don't understand why people think that's an anti-feat. The dude got hit with like the ultimate kryptonite and was still resisting it early on in the film. Plus he would have died anyway, because Godzilla's meltdown was like literally like just emitting ungodly amounts of heat. And after Junior got revived, Junior would have also been stronger than burning Godzilla, meaning that Destoroyah would have been screwed any way you slice it. So it's not like Destoroyah really had a chance at the end of the movie. He was just kind of destroyed because the plot wanted him to be. In the manga, it also took the meltdown, like, he had to literally get hit with the meltdown point blank while Godzilla was holding him in place in order for him to actually die, which, as I just explained, at the lowest low ball is an infinite 5D attack. However, due to burning zone scaling, it's more likely far higher than that, as it's actually described as being stronger than the Big Bang in some statements for the film. So, yeah, Destoroyah is not like super weak because Cairo lasers, his literal kryptonite, and a meltdown, his other kryptonite, tag teamed the shit out of him at the end of the movie. As for what Destoroyah is capable of doing, he has his katana horn, which is so strong that in the manga it basically casually cut the moon in half. And in the movie, it's shown to essentially split Burning Godzilla in two repeatedly, and then Burning Godzilla is just healing so fast it just doesn't matter to him. But he could essentially cut beings on his level in half with his casual swing of his katana horn. He also has the Micro-Oxygen Ray and Oxygen Destroyer Ray. The Micro-Oxygen Ray is his mouth beam. It's used repeatedly in the film. It can hurt Burning Godzilla. It can hurt people on his level. It's typically described as just being micro-oxygen. However, you can argue it's also imbued with Chernivog radiation, as it's also, I mean, he has Junior's DNA, so he could potentially have the atomic breath mixed in with it. However, the attack overall, there's massive misconceptions that it only affects organic beings that require oxygen, which it doesn't. It can destroy non-organic structures like buildings. So obviously it's hitting with actual force, and it probably has a relatively high temperature too. So it's not like it's just only hurting things that need oxygen, like people try to argue when they try to say that Monsterverse Ghidorah can beat Destoroyah because the Oxygen Destroyer didn't hurt him in the Monsterverse, when Destoroyah is a whole other beast than the Oxygen Destroyer, contrary to popular belief. His Oxygen Destroyer Ray, however, is even stronger than that, as it's never really shown in the film, but it is in a deleted scene, and it is considered part of Destoroyah's arsenal. It's also in the manga, which is based on old scripts for the film. And he was able to basically blast off part of Godzilla's dorsal plates with it, which is more damage than most kaiju in the Heisei era are capable of actually dealing to Godzilla due to how durable Godzilla is. And it's clearly stronger than standard mouth beam, so it's just the mouth beam on steroids. He can also just emit micro-oxygen, just passively, so he can destroy stuff. like that, which in the film it's only really shown as microform. However, we can assume it can be used in any form, as why would he lose abilities? All the other abilities we see in earlier forms translate to his perfect form anyway, so he should still have that ability. It's shown as a kind of like electrical aura around him that can just disintegrate stuff to like nothing. We also do see it with his juvenile form, however it's shown as actually just straight up causing explosions, and it's kind of maybe seen with his perfect form with the pulse he does when he transforms, destroying several buildings and going out in a kind of like red energy wave around him. He also does have regeneration. There's a huge misconception that he needs to switch into his earlier forms and reform to actually heal. That isn't required, he just does that because it's easier to heal a bunch of smaller forms than his perfect form. And it's also easier to regenerate completely when you're not a big ass target getting constantly beam spammed by Godzilla. In his littler forms, he can just kind of swarm and then go out, spread out, reform somewhere else, and just be stronger than before. And there's also him having his weak spot in his chest. Although it is a weak spot, we see him take damage there, and it's not like he's like on the ground dying. It definitely hurts him, but like doesn't like outright cripple him or anything. Destoroyah can also drain energy from opponents who realistically should be well above him in power, as Godzilla was basically just slightly below him at the start of the fight, or potentially a little further, slightly below for Heisei eras, not completely infinitely below him, as he wasn't. And by the end of his beam spam, he would have realistically been like several infinities above him, and Destoroyah can still drain energy from him from his bites and his tail. Also, you may have noticed I didn't mention speed for either of them, and that's because the speed for these guys is kind of questionable. Void Ghidorah's only feats of speed within the film are not that impressive, and same with Destoroyah, they don't seem all that impressive. However, cross-scaling Destoroyah with Space Godzilla, which he should realistically scale to, and then just going off the logic that Void Ghidorah is a higher dimensional being, both these guys should be in the infinite speed category, as Space Godzilla is able to travel from infinite distance in finite time, and his beams are actually faster than he is. Same with Godzilla's atomic breath, which Destoroyah can react to, so he should realistically be beyond infinite speed. Void Ghidorah being just a higher dimensional entity would automatically put him in the same caliber, if not a little bit higher than that. So with their complete stats laid out, who realistically wins a fight between these two? And I think the answer is kind of obvious for anyone who's been listening to this. Destoroyah should realistically beat Void Ghidorah. I know a lot of people probably would think otherwise on paper, but Destoroyah is blatantly stronger than Void Ghidorah. Yes, Void Ghidorah is made out of energy, and logically Destoroyah should be able to hit him physically. However, Destoroyah's laser horn and his micro-oxygen ray are energy-based attacks, and due to him upscaling Void Ghidorah as much as he does, even on his lowest end, he should be capable of outright just straight up hurting Ghidorah regardless. I mean, energy can still hit other energy. That's how energy works, and Void Ghidorah isn't outright immune to getting hurt. He should logically be capable of getting damaged. Destoroyah could also drain energy outright, so he could straight up just drain Void Ghidorah. If Void Ghidorah tried to do the same to Destoroyah, there's no evidence that he can adapt to dimensionalities or infinite layers of 5D above himself, meaning that even on the lowest end for Destoroyah, which would be several layers in infinite 5D, Void Ghidorah would most likely be incapable of draining power from him, as he would be outscaled so far that it just would kill him if he tried. Also, some might argue that Void Ghidorah being in a higher dimension and being able to just respawn plus his immortality would just auto give him a win, right? Not really. Destoroyah, in all honesty, could maybe even just straight up destroy that realm just due to how insane his AP is, and the fact his destructive capacity should be on the same level of burning Godzilla, who during the meltdown was going to destroy an even bigger realm. So Destoroyah, with his little pulse that he shows in his perfect form, should be capable of dealing similar damage if he was to go all out. Not to mention other characters in the Heisei era have shown they can do attacks and showings of power even casually that can reach infinite 5D levels, like Space Godzilla lighting up an infinite 5D universe. So Destoroyah should win. There's little argument that Void Ghidorah could beat Destoroyah, other than arguing and hinging completely on the fact that Destoroyah shouldn't be able to affect higher dimensional beings when he logically should. As both Showa and Heisei Godzilla, characters he scales directly to, can affect beings on a higher dimensional level than he is, and Destoroyah is on a higher dimensional level than Void Ghidorah. So saying that he couldn't even affect Void Ghidorah because Void Ghidorah is an actual higher dimensional being, whereas Destoroyah is still just the guy that scales the higher dimensional stuff, be kind of disingenuous, as we actually see characters affect beings on a higher dimensional level than themselves in the Heisei era. even if you were to argue that Void Ghidorah could just use his shadows to try to attack Destoroyah, ignoring that Void Ghidorah's shadows have only ever really shown affecting beings massively below anywhere even the lowest end for Destoroyah would be at, Destoroyah logically shouldn't really have to worry about that, as he could just regenerate even if they could hurt him, and he could just fly away at speeds faster than the shadows if he needed to. So even if Void Ghidorah was to try to hide in the void and attack him from there, Destoroyah is just so far above him in outright power that the odds of Void Ghidorah actually being able to hurt him are almost none. And there's also the possibility that Destoroyah, due to his constant adaptation, would just eventually evolve to the point where he could either outright enter the void or just blast a hole through the cosmology itself to kill Void Ghidorah, which other characters like Burning Godzilla should be capable of doing, as they're outright cosmology busters in and of itself. In fact, Destoroyah's highest possible scaling gets him all the way up to Megaversal, which is well above where Void Ghidorah's highest ends are. There are arguments to get Void Ghidorah up to Hyperversal and up to Boundless as well, but you can use those same arguments for Destoroyah due to the fact that most of them hinge on stuff like supergravity, superdimensionality, and super spaces, which are all things that the Heisei era also kind of scales to. And Destoroyah upscales most of the stuff that would scale to that, so even if you were to go wild with stuff arguing that the void is beyond dimensionality and stuff, you can make the same arguments to link the Heisei era up to that level, and both of them are hyper inconsistent and kind of stupid to even pull out. So no matter how hard you want to link Void Ghidorah, he logically isn't beating Destoroyah. While he can solo the vast majority of Heisei era, like characters like Space Godzilla who are on his level logically would not beat him in a fight, just due to how much hacks he has, and his just kind of win cons of just sitting in the void and attacking people on the same level as him, essentially making a fight between the two super one-sided because the other one can't even get to the void to attack him. Destoroyah is so far ahead of him that it just doesn't matter. Meaning that in the question of who's the strongest Godzilla villain in film history, it goes to Destoroyah, without a shadow of a doubt. Now, you can also argue that Kaiser Ghidorah is stronger than Destoroyah as well, due to some offhand statements, but I've already had a whole video on why that doesn't matter, so I'm not even going to get into that. Now, I'm not saying Destoroyah is the strongest Godzilla villain in general, as there's also stuff like the God Mountain and Godzilla vs. Hell that would definitely have scaling that could rival this, if not outright surpass it. But that's a battle for a different day. Anyways, the winner of this fight is 100%, without a shadow of a doubt, Destoroyah.